Welcome to the Keto Geek Podcast. Let's do this.
Health, nutrition, fitness, low-carb lifestyle.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Keto Geek Podcast. My name is Fahad, and I am today joined by
Corey,
who is
the alchemist at Keto Geek.
So, as an alchemist, what exactly do you do?
Well, pertaining to my actual job at Keto Geek, I am the production manager, so I make sure that all the energy pods get made in large quantities because you guys buy too many, and also to make sure they taste really, really good. That's my job here.
And it's an interesting challenge, taking something that tastes good and also creates appetite suppression. I think that was the fun part. Creating something that is really tasty is easy. Yes. Everybody's doing it. Mm-hmm. But what do you do when you have to end chronic conditions in the world? You have to make sure that the food tastes good, it leads to appetite suppression, works with your dietary protocol, and that's exactly what the energy pods are that we make here at Keto Geek. And speaking of these damn energy pods, you guys have sold us totally out on Amazon Prime.
Yeah, we sent so many boxes, yet you guys relentlessly just keep destroying our stock on Amazon, which is a good/bad problem to have.
Yeah, it's one of those, everybody keeps telling us, being sold out is a good problem to have. Yeah. You need to realize that. And I'm like, it's still a problem to be had, especially for a business like us. We're pretty much a startup, but it's really cool. You guys really support us, and it means a lot. We're changing the world better, and the anecdotes we get, the reviews we get, the feedback we get directly from the podcast and our product is just so positive. We have the most amazing group of people, really smart. And you know what I get to hear all the time on our Instagram direct message and through various social media tweets and stuff? People say that whenever we have a conversation nowadays about nutrition with other people, your podcast and your information makes us think a lot smarter. And we have a very educational approach rather than, you're a total douchebag sort of approach.
Yeah, it's not like we're cramming down information down your throat, but we're remaining open-minded here at Keto Geek. And as much as our name states that we're keto, we don't really adhere to the hardcore keto rules that you see out there. We look at appetite and obesity and all these issues from a global standing point of view, meaning the entire earth and as well as your entire body and what all those functions do.
Yes, and there's a lot of really cool research that I've been recently doing regarding ghrelin and insulin and how flavor manipulation can impact those things. So in due time, guys and gals, there's a lot of really cool stuff that's going to come out. So you can follow us on our various social media platforms and you'll get to know something really amazing. And I'm beginning to see the body more as an orchestration of different events, all the way from the mouth to the digestive systems to the brain. It seems to be all connected. And these isolation experiments that a lot of scientists do give us even deeper insight to how that adds to the whole symphony that's going on. But anyway, getting back to Amazon Prime, guys and gals, if we are sold out on our energy pods on Amazon Prime, please go to our own website, which is ketogeek.com, and you can order from there as well. And just to give you a side-by-side comparison of what's the difference between Amazon and ketogeek.com, why do I need to buy it from there instead of there? Well, if you order from our website, you get a beautiful handwritten note, and you get a fresh product directly from us. Think about fresh ghee that's being poured directly into the product, freshly ground premium quality nuts, and some delicious freshly made chocolate. That's the kind of stuff that you get from our website. The Amazon system is a little different because we send our product to them. There's a transition period, there's a travel time, there's a stocking time. So it takes about 7 to 8 days for the product to get to being even available for you to buy there. So that's the difference between Amazon and us. So you can choose either way, and we're cool with that. A lot of you have subscribed to our products on a monthly basis because you guys think we need to have amazing and delicious and great food every goddamn month into our mailbox. So you guys are cool. Right ahead. And I was checking out the prices of insulin, by the way. Monthly insulin cost is about $450. Diabetes management right now is $1,386 a month. That's how insane it is. So when you compare our energy pods to those kind of things, I think we might have a little bit of a problem here going on. So I think that right now the food and the pharmaceutical and the medical system is kind of like short-term initial payment, but long-term huge installments that you have to pay. It's the worst business deal ever.
You're not only hurting your body, though, or your wallet, you're hurting your body as well.
Yeah. And by the way, a lot of customers have given some positive feedback on the energy pods. Let's read some reviews.
Oh, yeah. Let's do that.
I should read it in Ivor Cummins' voice. I just want to.
I dare you.
Tanya H., who's a verified buyer, her review is, I just love these energy pods, and I must say I'm partial to the chocolate fudge. These have a hint of sweetness with a full body of chocolate. The consistency is great, as it makes your brain think it's getting something more filling. These have become a favorite daily treat for me, and I keep reordering them. I'm in love. That last part did not sound like Ivor.
90% of it sounded like Ivor.
Ivor Cummins. Anyway, you got a review too?
Yeah, I found one that I really liked.
I dare you. Accent. You have to use an accent.
Okay. This one's from Dean F. Awesome! So, I generally eat a low-carb keto diet with strength training 3 times a week. I found these pods helped me with that extra boost of energy, and I really didn't feel any spike to my insulin at all.
Really, Corey? You think so?
That's correct, Ivor.
You should check the CAC test, the calcification test. It'll give you a better idea. Anyway, guys and gals, we've had enough fun for today. So yes, go out there, buy our products, leave us a review. In fact, give this podcast an iTunes review. Please. It means a lot.
It gets us up there, and it really helps our exposure, and it helps people learn more about keto.
Exactly, and healthy diets in general. I think we've become pretty agnostic towards keto. I think I'm still pretty biased and a bit of a zealot in certain areas. Pretty sure of that. But, we've come a long way. But coming a long way, speaking of all of that, we have our podcast today, which goes back to our same old machine gun style, informational, bombarding sort of podcast. And today's guest is Alessandro Ferretti, who is an extremely smart guy, and he knows everything you need to know about metabolism and sports performance. This guy is one of the top gurus. He's like the coaches of a coaches, like a coach of a coaches, if that makes any sense. So he's like one of the top folks. So get ready for an informational powerhouse. Corey, you ready, bro?
Oh, I'm so ready.
Let's make it happen. Ladies and gentlemen, let me bring to you this podcast with Alessandro Ferretti.
Basically, what I've been doing is trying to make sense of what I studied in college by taking real case scenarios, real cohorts, and test some of the theory we taught at college. And despite sometimes things were true, other times I did not find the same results. So I'm not saying anything bad about my college, but there were some strong discrepancies on a few important topics. For example, meal frequencies, the macro constitutions of a meal, micronutrient levels, everything seemed pretty in line with what we were taught. And so through this experimentation, I worked hard in trying to remove any bias that I was taught, to a point that I started to collaborate with Waco Jarrus. And the reason why I like him so much is because he has no nutritional training. So he was completely oblivious of any dogma or anything that people would teach just out of a book or personal interest or bias or whatever that may be, or personal ideas even. And he has a great, amazing analytical mind. And quite a few times I presented him with some data and I said, Waco, there you go. What does it tell you? rather than me trying to make sense because I knew that eating little and often is good for blood sugar level, for example. So this is how my journey started. And another big promoter of that journey was the fact that on a healthy diet, mainly organic food, good lifestyle, very physically active, engaging in sport at a reasonably high level or a reasonably decent level, my fasting glucose was constantly elevated. Not elevated to say diabetic, but it was always between the 90 and 110, which on the quality of the diets and the lifestyle choices I had at the time, it didn't make any sense. So that's the reason why I started to research. And I think what dramatically helped me in what I was researching is a very, as much as I possibly could, an objective approach to it. So I didn't want to support one thing or another. I just wanted to observe. And that, I think, contributed so much to what I know, well, to the little I know, because as mentioned, the more I research, the more I study, the more ignorant I feel, which is rather normal. But it's been really, really interesting for me to get stuck into that and run live projects with, live cohort of people. And the other thing that was, I think, interesting was the fact that the subject I was taking were not only diseased people, were also healthy people, where the magnitude of effect of an intervention is much harder to show up. So, for example, if you take a diabetic and you remove one meal a day of their meal and you substitute that with a good meal, you are very likely to see an effect because there is a good change. Whereas if you take a healthy individual and you change one thing, often, obviously it depends what you're changing, but often you don't see such a big effect because they are already healthy. So I wanted to test some of these things in healthy individuals in order to see what actually was causing a substantial difference. And that was a biggie one, especially with the ketogenic approach, because many times we see ketogenic application in the type 2 diabetes, higher fasting glucose, insulin resistance, which is something I would, of course, consider strongly as ketogenic diet in this subset population. But when you go and try to apply that to already healthy individuals, then these changes, if noticeable at all, become minimal. So that's the reason why I wanted to test that. So this, I think, were some of the main promoters of my interest in my research.
Okay, now we can open some can of worms right now. So, first of all, you mentioned that fasting glucose was elevated when you're an athletic person, like you've been relatively athletic throughout your life. Is that a theme that recurs commonly, and why is that? Why do you think that's the case?
Right. So we think, well, most people or some people, so people in general, think that if they do physical activity and eat a healthy diet, they don't need to measure their fasting glucose, or they don't need to measure certain simple physiological variables. And unfortunately, I don't think that is a wise choice. It could be superfluous many times or sometimes, but I think that every now and again to check, for example, fasting glucose or heart rate variability every X number of days may be wise, because these can be used as proxies in order to understand loosely how the body is doing. And the reason why I'm saying this, because it came to a big surprise that for 3 months in a row, my fasting glucose was in the 100, 110. And I couldn't really understand that, because I thought, and it was really interesting because I started to research genetic. I did a few lectures for a company called DNA Fit, and which I love. Really simple test that gives you all peer review papers, and it gives you a very, a few sets of genes that have been researched quite intensely, and tells you carbohydrate sensitivity, which happens to be that I have. So I could have said, right, I have carbohydrate sensitivity, I have diabetes in my family, therefore it must be genetics, it must be my makeup. But then I refused to accept that, and thinking, well, okay, what can I do in my environment that can perhaps keep the fasting glucose level as low as possible? And what was really interesting to me was that the fasting glucose level was responsive to the diet, of course, responsive to the quality of the diet, responsive to the timing of the energetic intake, the frequency as well, but also started to correlate quite strongly with inflammatory response. And this is when my research diverged from purely ketogenic applications into inflammatory response and metabolic flexibility. So people can have an elevated fasting glucose or an elevated daily average glucose, especially when not just the diet is poor, we know that, but also when there is a type of inflammatory response, more of a chronic nature. And I'm saying more of a chronic nature because it's the one that is harder to detect. So, for example, if you have an active acute inflammatory response, you normally know it. So you know that you have an injury, you have an infection, you have something. And normally that has an acute phase, normally known as APR, acute phase response. When people are in acute phase response, they got all the normal signs. So they have fever or redness or swelling or pain or whatever that may be. So people know, right, my fasting glucose level is elevated because there is an inflammatory response in progress. Some of the cells of our immune system preferentially switch to glycolytic pathway at that time, therefore is all justified. Now, this is only one side of the story. Unfortunately, a chronic low-grade inflammatory response, this is when we don't actually have signs. So we don't have redness, we don't have fevers. We may have at times some malaise, I don't feel too good today, or I'm not tip-top, or whatever that may be. But we don't have something that would say, right, I have an inflammatory response. And this is the dangerous ones, because if they're not picked up, then people carry on with their lives and they may not realize that their insulin sensitivity could be substantially reduced, therefore affecting their metabolism in a negative manner. If it keeps going, I'm not saying the insulin resistant is bad all the time. That's not what I'm saying, yeah? So at times our body needs to have something like that in order to buffer, for example, blood stores in certain specific scenarios. But these are reasonably not rare, but not as common as insulin resistant given due to poor choices or poor lifestyle choices or inflammatory responses or what have you. So I think one of the most important from a personal point of view, discoveries was that the fasting glucose, it can also be used as a reflection, as a proxy for chronic low-grade inflammatory response, especially when it diverges as far as correlation with heart rate variability. So that has been very useful to me in dealing with athletes, because when I get referred athletes, even at Olympic standards or Olympian, we see that their fasting glucose is very, very, very erratic. And in two individuals in particular in the last year or so, have been basically in the pre-diabetic zone, which is quite scary, because you think, okay, so the amount of exercise has a kind of U-shaped correlation. So complete lack of or too much might affect negatively fasting glucose level, whereas the right dose, whatever that means, actually helps fasting glucose level and glucose level. So and so is for other lifestyle factors. So the kind of too much of a good thing may not be a good thing, and this is what we have identified in exercise.
Okay, so about the chronic inflammation, what kind of other ripple effects does that have?
Well, there is nothing that all of a sudden happens, but it is thought by scientists that this is what could potentially promote long-term chronic degenerative diseases. So all the diseases that you don't tend to catch, you tend to develop. So links have been made to, the type 3 diabetes known as Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases. Links have been made to also indirectly, not only directly, but, directly, indirectly, to more metabolic diseases and type 2 diabetes. So the ramification can be quite profound. And maybe this is where the weakest link will actually show up. So if someone has a predisposition for Alzheimer's, for example, like myself, rather than manifest in a certain way, will more likely manifest in type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, rather than perhaps Parkinson or some other long-term chronic degenerative diseases. And these are this is the reason why I think it's so important, because if people are able to spot these scenarios 10, 15 years in advance, then this could actually be a very, very good, so a small change of lifestyle and healthier choices, or more precise choices rather than healthier, because some people, if you look at the diet and the lifestyle, like myself as I was, you think, well, these are really healthy individuals. You don't need to measure your cholesterol. You don't need to measure your fasting glucose level, as I was told at the local surgery. And you think, well, humor me. Just have a check. You see me once a year, so I'm not exactly a burden on the health status of the country. So, it's my yearly check. Just humor me on that one. And we found it was elevated, so then I had to go back. So I think people can have very strong leverage if they would get to know via proxies that maybe things are not going as they should, and then they can take action. Which is the reason why I would focus on heart rate variability and fasting glucose. These two proxies don't tell you specifically what it is, but they tell you that your sympathetic nervous system activation and your potential for chronic low-grade inflammation isn't going in the right direction. And this is when people can say, right, is this justified? Yes. Okay, fine. I'll wait until whatever needs to be resolved is resolved. Is it not justified? Then this is when things start to become more interesting. So for me at the time, with the knowledge I had, it was not justified, because I thought, well, hang on a minute. I'm eating a healthy diet. I'm doing sport at least 4 to 5 times a week. 2 of them are very intense sessions. And mix of aerobic and resistance training or HIIT training, and yada, yada, yada. And you think, right, how on earth? And, and that's the reason why. So,
okay. So with this knowledge in mind, let's say if I'm a high-level athlete, what practical steps do I need to take when I see these numbers start rising or things are going a little off? Should I work on my dietary protocol, or should I go out and maybe train less or train in a different way? What can I do? I know this is a very general question, but let's open this Pandora's box.
Yes, it's really interesting. It's a great question because I still have not found a proper answer. So I'll tell you what I do. Generally speaking, I try to follow the 80-20 rule, meaning what is the 20% investment which will give me the 80% return? So what is the thing that I can do right away that is probably going to cause or generate the biggest improvement? And I was trained as a nutritionist. And of course, being a nutritionist is all about the diet, right? So, and this is what I thought for so many years, erroneously so. And the reason being is, so when I the real wake-up call, Fahad, was when I started to have virtually 9 out of 10 patients with a diet that did not justify their symptoms. A little bit like myself, kind of, I don't know if you believe in the law of attraction. I didn't. And then I thought, maybe there is something in there. I don't know. I'm getting all these patients that are virtually carbon copy of myself. I don't know. But anyhow, let's leave it like that. And you start thinking, well, okay, so we can go from 4 pieces of broccoli to 6. We can go to, a portion of cabbage to 2. We can add and refine a little bit, but it's not going to give me the biggest improvement because the diet is already pretty damn good to start with. Unless there are allergens in the diet, I get that. But once we have assessed for these things, in my patient diet at the time, when people had a really poor diet, did cause some substantial changes. But in recent years, that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. I had a client, a reasonably high-level athlete, that had also a heart attack. And you think, okay, this is someone 5 years younger than me. And with a diet that, in my view, is impeccable. And you think, okay, hang on a minute. Let's assume my understanding of dietary or diet is completely wrong because I think that diet is really good and the guy gets a heart attack. So what am I missing here? I'm either not a nutritionist, I got completely wrong idea about nutrition, thinking that is a good one, or diet isn't the most important factor. And this is when I started to research on fasting glucose level and inflammatory response and heart rate variability. I'm hoping this makes some sense. So to answer to your question, I wanted to give you an example that, unfortunately, most of the time, I call it professional bias, because if I'm a nutritionist, then I'm likely to think that everything is about the nutrition. If you are a personal trainer, everything is about the exercise. If you are a chiropractor, everything is about, body alignment or body work. So, and that was a cold shower, not the one I enjoy regularly. That was a bad cold shower. That was like wake up in the morning with, in a nice bath kind of thing. So the first thing I do, I look at the athletes, 5 main areas, and I tackle them in order of what I think is the one that requires the most attention. So obviously dietary quality, so the whole diet thing, quality, timing, what macro constitution, the usual stuff, nutrient density, and so on. Second one, the life load, so what people refer to as stress response. I prefer not to call it stress. I prefer to call it life load. First time I heard this term was from one of my colleagues in Harley Street in London, called Dr. Jack Kreindler. And I love that term because it describes the sum of all the stresses, good or bad, that someone has in their life. So, for example, I love my son. I would jump on a train, under a train for him, yada, yada, yada. But it's still a load. It's still something that requires processing, attention, work, and etc., etc. I love what I'm doing, but as far as job, and yet it's still a load. I still wake up at a certain time, do lectures and research. So it's good stress, but it's still a load. So that's the reason why I look into life load. Then I look into physical activity, too little, too much. Then I go into sleep, and the last one, chronobiology. So in the last, I don't know, 9 months, a year, I've researched quite a bit on that topic. And what caught my attention was a podcast from a PhD graduate called Greg Potter at the University of Leeds, and mentioning a study during a podcast where food, so the relation that there is between chronobiology and food. And I thought, wow, that's the missing link. That's the link between grandpa and grandma's habits and what I studied. Because what I studied is you don't eat too late. But what does late mean? What does it even mean? We were not given a time. So you shouldn't have breakfast at the time. You shouldn't have lunch at that time. You shouldn't have dinner at that time. We were not told anything in relation to that. We were not told about chronotypes. We were not told about anything in relation to chronobiology. So that really sparked my attention. So these are the 5 areas. And when I look at an athlete, to answer to your question, I think, okay, which one of these do I think is the furthest out from what I think would be ideal? And this is then I started to tackle in that diet. And then I subcategorize. So in the diet, for example, I say, okay, the diet isn't actually that great in this specific individual. What is the nutrient density? What is the macro ratio? Is the macro ratio suitable for this person at this moment in time? For example, people that are very heavily stressed, going to keto, it's a nightmare. It's an absolutely nightmare. And I personally think that many times is further restricting, further generating further stress into the individual. So I may not choose to use that approach unless there is some blandly obvious, type 2 diabetes kind of stuff and insulin resistance and they're eating kilos of carbs. And in that case, you think, right, okay, dude, you need to take it on the chin kind of thing. And chronobiology. So are they doing the right thing but at the wrong time? Are they following what is the master clock? What are the peripheral clocks like? To a point that I nearly signed up for a chronobiology course this September, but then with a house renovation and extension, I kind of lost track of that. So I'm hoping to complete a course in early 2019 there is a course done by University of Oxford. Nothing major, but in order to have a decent understanding of the basics at least, rather than just keep pestering chronobiologists and interviewing them and harassing them for information. The poor guys.
Wait, so I'm not going to let you get away with that term called chronobiology. So let's explain to people what it's all about. And I'm also curious myself. Let's pry this a little bit more.
So our biology follows natural rhythms. And these can be classified in three main ones. One that will be shorter than 24 hours, one that would equal about 24 hours, and others that are longer than 24 hours. And these rhythms help our physiology in the way how I see it, by the way. I'm not a chronobiologist, so maybe some people would disagree with that. But our body follows paths and rhythms. And these rhythms are important to respect. And in recent years, in the last decade or so, some really interesting research started to come out. And it's really what is really interesting is that people that were doing, for example, research on fasting and chronobiology started to actually meet in this research, because they started to think that a good diet is a good diet, but could be even a better diet if we add the chronobiology element. So we started to realize that our gut has a rhythm. Our hormonal secretions have a rhythm within the 24 hours. And so these are, I think, very important, because if we get the wrong cues from our environment, then things don't tend to match up. And for example, if we get stressed when we should be resting, and if we feel, so for example, when in the book I'm writing, I took the example of me going to my first experience of traveling to the US, lecturing, mentioning that adrenaline is a very good thing, because I was lecturing the day after I arrived, and I arrived in the evening with all my body clocks completely phased out. And I didn't know anything about jet lag. I've never really experienced this. So I didn't know. So, okay, yeah, I feel a bit tired, but I'll push through it. And I thought, Mamma mia, that wasn't, and I do apologize for the people that listened to my very first lecture in the US, my first time in the US, because I don't think I was, on the ball. But then adrenaline kicked in, and, things were okay, I guess. But what was really interesting is that for the first time I experienced what does it mean when my body clocks are not in line with the environment. So when the cues are wrong, when I should be resting and yet I'm working, and when then I was wide awake in the night, and etc. So that is a blunt example of what is normally called as normal jet lag. Unfortunately, nowadays, there are some really good podcasts from Human OS with Greg Potter, for example, and quite a few around actually now, that, these researchers go in good details on the potential effect of detrimental or what we call de-entrained circadian rhythms. So when rather than using light and behavioral choices to entrain our body clocks, these are not entrained, not in line with these cues. And this is typical for our society, to the point that now there is a term that is used, which is called social jet lag. So when, rather than following normal rhythms, we artificially change our environment without thinking of the consequences that has on our biology. The typical will be, the blue light of screen, blue intense light of blue screens late in the evening, and then people having poor sleep. If someone, I'm pretty sure that everyone knows that there is ample amount of data, of scientific data on blue light, suppressing melatonin and et cetera, et cetera. So, and I started to experiment with following my chat with these researchers and their work, and reading their work, or listening to their work. with food, being a nutritionist, and said, okay, well, that's really interesting, because grandpa and grandma were very, very precise in their eating, and they were never eating too late at all. And these were in train and in line with their rhythms, which they kept since kids. And, they both died in the 90s. All four of them, all three of them, 3 out of 4 died in the 90s, and the other one died in mid-80s. So, pretty decent, pretty great, actually. And you think, well, okay, so what were the habits? And there are various studies for showing that they were investigating the habits of centenarian, the blue zones, for example. So we're looking at some aspects of the lifestyle, but what they may have not realized at the time, that there was also a chronobiology element to it.
So what I'm thinking right now is, let's say if I go to the gym, I'm simplifying everything right now. I go to the gym and I do bicep curls. That seems to be sort of like a out of the whack crazy idea. I mean, I don't know, did we have bicep curls in our evolutionary history? I don't know. But doing these curls every day at 5 a.m., that seems like a good routine. I don't know, how do I know it's a good stressor versus bad stressor?
If I tell you the answer, I think we'll both be millionaires. I think there are some standards that I would follow, which when you feel awake, and we all have certain rhythms. You might have come across chronotypes. Some exercises may be best suited for some individuals at a certain time. For some others, seems to be they are suited to different individuals at a different time. Personally, when in my simplicity, I would try not to do any strenuous activity when too close to bed, either side. So if you have to wake up, if you have to use the device to wake up to then go to the gym, and you don't feel awake and you use the gym to feel awake, I think is not great.
Okay.
What was really interesting for me is that in a very small of individuals, so I have very little saying in this. As I said, I'm not a chronobiologist, but I decided to test, and I think it was no more than 5 people. I said, okay, you do exactly the same exercise, but instead of doing it at, early in the morning, where you have to use an alarm to wake up, from the moment that someone has to use an alarm, that wakes up always roughly at the same time. Yeah, that is. But if someone wakes up roughly at the same time and still needs an alarm to wake up, I think they're sleep deprived. So if you are already sleep deprived, then adding another load, I'm not sure how profitable that is for long-term health. Okay. So I'm not talking of the one day that you forgot to go to the gym the previous day, or you couldn't because of whatever reason, and for one day, then you go. I have not seen any data that the body isn't able to withstand a few changes here and there. However, if someone regularly does that, I think the total load is increased, and I'm not sure the benefit of exercises versus the benefit of exercising at the wrong time and the cascade of effects that might lead to, which one of the two I would prefer. So in Olympians or high-end athletes that also have a day job, I think things are a little bit trickier. But one thing that if you're working with professional athlete is clear is that they seem to be more geared up to understand recovery rather than just pushing hard. Whereas people that have normal jobs and they want to be high-end elite athletes, these are the ones that I normally find most at risk of my subset of population, the one that I see. I can't generalize with that because they're trying to juggle family, work, and very, very intense training schedule, including periodization and et cetera, et cetera. So these will be the harder one. And if there are times in which they have to train at certain times, great. But as long as they maintain an eye on some physiological variables to understand if things starting to be affecting negatively. So it was really interesting that I used to work at a gym and we had shift, and one of the shifts started at 6 and the other one finished at 10. So you need to wake up at 5:30 and you're not in bed before 12. By the time that you wind down, go home and have something to eat because you're hungry, and et cetera, et cetera. So these two were the days in which my body felt the worst. And only decades later started to make more sense. And at the time I needed an alarm, so potentially was sleep deprived. My chronobiology was all kind of firefighting because one day was an early start, the other day was normal, then one off, then late, and then early. So it was kind of chopping and changing all the time. So generally speaking, amongst researchers, once you get some basics right, try to stay in that rhythm. The body can then adapt to that within reason. So if someone has always exercise at 5:30 in the morning and they don't have any symptoms, then great for them. As long as they are able to monitor, if they are okay. However, could it be better if they exercise a different type of the day? And there are a few studies that are reasonably, if I remember well, they're quite contradictory because one would say you should exercise at that time, the other one say you should exercise at that time. Chronotypes may come into play, but generally speaking, I try to exercise during daylight hours. That seems to be ideal. Of course, summer versus winter away from the equator, that can be a substantial difference. However, definitely no high-intensity exercise within 4 to 5 hours from retiring, and not exercising straight away. So allow the person to feel awake. These are the two basic principles in my ignorance of chronobiology that I tend to follow.
So you do a lot of research. When is it a good idea to look at evolutionary history and abstract some knowledge from it? And when do you realize, okay, this is just BS and it doesn't really translate well into our current scientific literature or environment? So I assume as a researcher, you sort of try to pick this information. Okay, this is relevant, this is not. How do you go about doing that?
I flip a coin. No. So, okay, one thing that always... So I used to be a motorbike racing engineer. And I tried to understand things at my best ability. And sometimes I just didn't have that ability. So I had to work at it to try to understand it. So one of the things that always... When I hear someone saying, we used to, my first question is, how the heck do you know? I dealt indirectly with some of the cyclists of Tour de France, yeah? And there were people indirectly, so you don't see my name anywhere, I was asked a couple of opinions when keto was, everyone was keto kind of thing, and it was just very new, very trendy, very whatever. And I could hear people saying, oh, this cyclist eats that diet. And you think, how do you know? Because I have sheets of data and I'm still not sure that the athlete is eating that because I'm not there with the person, right? So when I hear people making claims on evolutionary biology, especially the ones that don't really have any training, I'm thinking, how do you know? So the best thing I can go by is looking at traditions and try to understand these traditions, one. Two, are they relevant for our normal modern daily living? And often there is a massive clash. So, for example, my grandpa used to have naps every day. During my rehab, there is no way I can sleep more than 6 hours, 6.5 hours. So 1 month is 6 hours and 29 the average. The other month is 6 hours and 32. So we're not talking that 1 month is 6 hours and the other month is 8. Is within 15 minutes for the last 2 years. The monthly average with a reasonably decent device. Okay, so what has been interesting is I said, right, I need to increase my recovery. What can I do? And I looked at Grandpa. He used to nap every day. But how many people do you know they are in a position that comes lunchtime, they have their lunch, they stand up, go for a walk to start some digestion kind of thing, and then go for an hour or an hour and a half nap? Most people cannot afford to do that. Not only in a monetary aspect, but they cannot afford because they don't have the time to afford it. So, you know, they work in the city, they work away from home, they do all sorts of things. So in any time of my life where I had to dramatically increase my recovery for whatever reason, one of the things I focused on is trying to look at traditions that my grandparents and their friends, especially the centenarian ones, or the just about out the centenarian group, they were actually following. And then I look, how is it applicable to our modern living? So for most people, for example, I'm taking the nap kind of in the afternoon, assuming the nap is good for everyone, which is a big assumption, which is, you know, biphasic sleep is a whole other topic. But it was really interesting is that I try to apply principles that either there is some research that have been proven to be beneficial in somewhat, the magnitude of effect of a certain choice is decent, so it's good, and at the same time, you actually see that you can apply this science and these traditions to that. So I always take the evolutionary biology, I try to be quite critic of it. Not in a negative manner, but first question is, how do you know? And then I look at the research, and then I look at the application, and then I look what population in more recent centuries perhaps used to do. And then I try to apply it. This is how I deal with that.
Okay. Sounds good. We haven't even reached our first question that was on my question list, by the way. So how crazy is that? This goes to show that this could be a very, very, very long podcast if we really want to make it. But that's really cool. Like I said, you're an information powerhouse. There's a really high chance you're coming back. So just to go a little bit backtrack on what on one of the questions at least is there any research that is coming out in the keto or nutrition world in general that just has you captivated and you're like kind of like waiting, like how I wait for the next season of Game of Thrones? Is there a study that has a similar effect on you?
It has, but it's not nutrition. I know. So I really would like to see. So as far as, let me rephrase all of what I just said. So in the nutrition world, that is more relevant to your podcast. Let's give some parameters, because otherwise, it's not going to be very relevant, and we can spend another hour talking about something that's got nothing to do with what you wanted to ask me. So. I was asked to co-author a paper on high intensity interval training on 4 weeks ketogenic diet and how that impacted performance. And I was asked my opinion on a few points. And the main author, Lucas Cyprian, did, I think, a great job. I would love to see more interventional long-term studies on keto application in sport. We went through the phases that keto wasn't good and then might be good for long endurance events, so high volume, low intensity. Then we come out with our study. I was expecting to notice a drop in performance after 2 to 3 weeks following a strict ketogenic diet, and we didn't. And I think other authors or co-authors were surprised, because in some individuals it can work very well, some others it doesn't. But we know that high volume, low intensity exercise, ketogenic diet may stand much better chance to work very well than high intensity. So the main author decided to try to do a ketogenic diet in trained but not elite. That could be a different cohort. That could be a different result. Yeah. And try the ketogenic diet and high intensity interval training. And as mentioned, I was expecting a drop in performance, but we didn't. So, and it was really interesting because for the keto followers, that was a massive win. And for the keto opposers, also was a win. Because, the keto people said, I've seen comments saying, keto is at least as good and keto works and et cetera. For the keto opposers, so you see your diet doesn't improve performance. And that's the reason why I phrased the title, I phrased the end of the study exactly as we phrased it for when we published, which is ketogenic diet doesn't show a drop in performance after 4 weeks. And that is exactly what we found. So I can't say it's better or worse. All we know is that this is what happened. And obviously, for every study you publish, you want to do other 20. Because you said, okay, first question that jumped into my mind was, if it would have been 8 weeks, would they have dropped performance? Given what I had personally noticed in individuals. So what I would love to see, to answer to your question, is what would happen to the people that would have been on a ketogenic diet for a really long time, and what would happen to their performance in both untrained, trained, and elite athlete. So I would love to see that. So is there a way that eventually could work? One thing, I would want to do that out of curiosity, not because I want to put every person on a ketogenic diet. That's not what I do. So I still think that would be interesting. And also noticing if there are very specific haplotypes that would favor that diet rather than others, which makes perfect logical sense to me to say that it does. So, so certain genetic makeups that would favor, that diet, and they can extrapolate energy at the same rate, and they can make the glucose that is necessary to burn the fats, quickly enough in generating all, oxaloacetate and all that. So this is what I would love to see. And the other thing I'm eager to see happening is more studies on circadian biology and food. So we had Sachin Panda that stumbled across, a few things in eating in a certain window. There is a PhD on the net called Bill Lagakos, I do apologize if I said that wrong, that wrote a lovely article about early time restricted feeding and late time restricted feeding, noticing differences. There are a couple of papers, mainly one that goes through an eating window, a time restricted feeding window, which I think is really, really great. I have seen amongst my subset of population of patients that people, they skip breakfast, and I detest using the term skip. That already is a mental limitation, because you can't do that because you have to skip it, if that makes sense. So it has a negative connotation potentially to someone's relationship with food, because they have to skip something, so they can't have it. I normally say, I phrase it differently. I say, have a later breakfast and an early dinner. So all it means that you have a restricted time of window that you can, what do I do for lunch? Eat as you want. Most of the times they automatically eat so much less. So, but anyhow, I'd love to see more research in chronobiology and diet, and chronobiology in general. This is what I would really, really love to see. Intake of nutrients at a certain time rather than others. So yeah, that kind of direction.
My biggest gripe, which I've talked about a lot on this podcast, is whenever someone says, oh, a ketogenic diet does X, Y, Z. So we're technically a food company. So our impulse right away is, what is the composition? What kind of macronutrients? Where did the fats come from? Because we work with individual fats, like we work with MCT oil. So speaking from a food company perspective, and maybe just as a person who's interested in a ketogenic or any sort of, doesn't have to be ketogenic diet, how do I take practical takeaways? Because a 90% carb diet could technically mean an all-potato diet. I don't know if that would fare well against a well-formulated ketogenic diet, for example, when it comes to performance or improved body composition. So that seems to be a missing link. How do you deal with this?
That's a great question. I think time and space play a major role in deciding what nutritional approach someone has, including timing, so for example, if we take this in a much larger scale, as an example, time restricted feeding for a professional athlete, well, that's not going to end up well, is it? It's, you have muscle protein synthesis that can be stimulated by certain frequency and quantity. So trying to spread the protein content and protein intake across the whole day for as much as possible, and et cetera, et cetera. Someone that has a certain type of activity and perhaps they need to reduce their weight rather than increase the mass, then perhaps they would benefit out of that. So I try to understand I try to ask myself basically a question. Does the person needs to be in a catabolic state, having to lose adiposity or whatever, or do they need anabolic state? Most of the people that I see are perhaps more into the anabolic bracket. And that's the reason why using keto, I don't know if it's the best tool they have. It can work, and it did work, and I saw him work. The guys at Ketogenic. So no one can say ketogenic diet doesn't support muscle gains, because if you look at them, and I trust implicitly, Luis Villasenor and all the other guys. So we know that it works. My question is it the best tool for every individual that comes across with that requirement? And so I started to test it, and in some individuals definitely didn't seem to work very well. Whereas with some others, it worked amazingly. So the first thing I try to understand is what do they require, and in which space the people are in. So is it very stressful situation, eating out a lot, having some strong limitations, in which case a ketogenic diet may be more taxing than beneficial. And in that case, obviously, I may swerve for, if they still need to be in a catabolic state, so they need to lose adiposity, then I would fix the protein at whichever level, and then play around with the macro. But I don't think that following something very strict or something else very strict is ongoingly an optimal choice, because there are seasons, there are environments, there are different loads, there are different metabolic states, which I think may suit different macro and micronutrient, perhaps, proportion, ratio, quantities. So, of course, if someone is dealing with people that seems to be more overweight and insulin resistant and having all sorts of metabolic issues, then in that case, of course, ketogenic diet or a low carbohydrates approach will definitely be my first thought and my first point of call to see if it's possible to apply it. Whereas if someone wants to is very metabolically efficient, and they don't have excess fat, they're already lean, then maybe and it's summer, for example, then maybe ketogenic diet is not it wouldn't be my first point of call. Or for a professional athlete that isn't in a specific period. I do use ketogenic application in athletic performance, but in a periodized manner. So, for example, when people want to increase the load and try to push harder with less, so allowing the body to try to make more out of less, in this case glucose, in order to train the body, but not constantly. In competition, I definitely wouldn't advise that. In an elite event where there is a time that has to be beaten, or someone that has to be raced, or there is a time limit to the event, not one of these 120-miler marathon kind of thing that you can take 4 days, but as long as you last, then in that case, once again, I go back on more low carbohydrate type of approach. So I hope this gives you an idea that the answer to your question is, I don't know. But there are many elements. I definitely cannot generalize. But what I can generalize is I try to understand the metabolic state of the person. And given that, then I choose a specific dietary approach, which I think at the time is more appropriate than another.
Okay. You got 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. What is metabolic efficiency? So let's get into that.
So metabolic efficiency and metabolic flexibility are two terms that I use as jargon, primarily to define someone's ability to, so how resilient they are, how well do they cope with changes within their environment, how flexible is their body in, for example, switching metabolic substrate to generate energy or adapt to a certain environment or versus another. And the reason why I call them like that is purely down to, I took that from athletic performance. So when someone is able to withstand different stressors and different environments and different training program, and their resilience is very high, then it's great for them, especially if they're leading up to a race and they maintain that. Unfortunately, nowadays, we have much reduced margin of error, meaning that there are more diseased people. So I was doing a research apart from my book and for a colleague here in the UK, where fasting glucose level in the last, from the 1960s, has increased of around 20 to 25 milligrams per deciliter on average, which is substantial. That's substantial. Anything above 90 is a little alarm bell. It would catch my attention. Anything that stays above 100 and 110, so 105, 110 and above, definitely there is something that has to be justified to be at that level. So ideally, when someone is metabolically flexible, it doesn't matter what you feed them, the body maintains a good physiology. So what was really interesting for me is that when I started to investigate my conundrum of elevated fasting glucose and started to go on a ketogenic dietary approach, glucose came down. But then every time I was having carbs at the time, glucose would go back up again. So my question was to myself, am I locked into this for life? This is not how my ancestors ate. This is not ancestors for the one that I could trace, because I asked Grandma, I said, Grandma, your grandma, what did they eat? Well, what she could get, what she could find, what she could grow, what she could catch. Right, okay, so let me rephrase the question. What did she grow? What did she catch? So what was the diet? So now I wanted some real information that were transcended to me. And what was really interesting to me is that at the time they didn't know keto, and yet they were pretty damn healthy. So why would I have to be on a ketogenic diet in order to control my glucose? Is this going to be long term? So these were all the questions that sparked my interest in order to research in that specific area. And the first thing I came across was researching why then the glucose was normal when people have a high carbohydrate. So I then started to rephrase that. So excess of carbohydrate can lead to inflammatory response, sympathetic activation, lack of sleep, chronobiology, and whatever you want. So the determining factor may, in my view, so the long-term solution may not be a diet proportion, a specific diet proportion, as long as it's within certain limits, within certain values. So if you do not overeat, if you don't have excess of a certain substrate or another substrate, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's the reason why I think that people from they have ketogenic groups or they follow ketogenic approach are more likely to mess with certain people. And what I often see is people saying ketogenic diet works, and another one say ketogenic diet doesn't work because one is a type 2 diabetics and the other one is a bodybuilder that has a genetic predisposition not to do well on a ketogenic diet. So I think context is my main deciding factor in looking at macro ratio, micro ratio, and all the other elements. So it's a great question, and this is how I normally approach it. So I think, right, okay, what's behind this? So time and space. Is the person more suited to do that, or is he more suited to this? What is the relationship with the food? Are they orthorexic? Are they anorexic? Are they, what are they? And that is what tends to swing my decision.
Okay, fantastic. Wow. Go ahead.
In a nutshell, when metabolic flexibility is the body's ability to adapt to different states despite what is the state. Okay. So you see someone, I have not been on a ketogenic diet in the summer, especially during my rehab, because inflammation tends to skew the fuel preference towards glycolysis, and I wanted to stimulate my rehab in order to. And in that case, I thought, my glucose level is going to be much higher. Has still not breached the 90s. After the whole summer, I have been on a substantially higher amount of carbohydrates. Is still perhaps not as high as general standard unhealthy diet, and the quality is good and my micronutrient is good. So that means that the proportions of the substrate become way less important when the person has that ability to withstand changes, i.e. metabolic flexibility. So my glucose is still around 4.5, 4.3, 4.8, depending if I'm training, if I'm not training. So it's still below 90, your 90. That I was talking millimolar. I'm so sorry. I just switched between the two. So it's still below 90, despite, and was interesting because yesterday my physio said, Alex, you got even leaner. And I went, right, I've been eating more carbs. And that's really interesting. This is just purely by chance, not because I'm doing something. So that means that I have maintained a certain flexibility that I'm able to withstand macronutrient changes. Now, of course, if you then go out of kill with micronutrients, with chronobiology, and then you add lots of carbs, and then you add inflammation to that, and then you add bad carbs on top of the carbs, then I would go healthy keto. I hope this makes some sense.
It makes sense in the sense that it takes the right ingredients to create the perfect storm. Is that a correct way to put it?
Precisely. That's the English version of what I was trying to say for the last half an hour.
So if we talked about flexibility, what about efficiency? Is that a synonym or is that different?
I tend to consider these two different. So the easiest way for me to define that is the body's ability to do more with less. So have you come across a great mind called Dr. Tommy Wood?
Nope.
You don't? Okay, I suggest that you may search Dr. Tommy Wood and Christopher Kelly at Nourish, Balance and Thrive. So one day, Waco and I were yapping and chatting, and Dr. Tommy Wood, I'm just going to call him Tommy. And Tommy sent us a question and say, so are you considering your caloric calculation on the constraint model, on the additive model? And I went, what? I trained as a nutritionist and I've never heard of these things. And I'm very prompt in admitting my ignorance as far as I can see it. And I thought, what the heck is that? So basically, there are two main models. And the first one is you have a basal metabolic rate, and anything you do during the day on top of that, you need to add it. Guess what? That's the additive model. But I could never understand why I went for a ride at medium intensity for 2.5, 3 hours. If it's sub 2.5 hours, I'm normally fasted, and all I take is water. If it's sub 1 hour or 1 hour and a half, I don't even take water. If it's that kind of medium intensity. And I thought, I looked at my watch and I looked at my gadget thing and I said, you burn 1,230 calories. And I thought, you what? I have here that amount. I'm not even hungry. I'm not even, okay, let's assume there are hormones that disrupt my perception of hunger. Let's assume all of these. But I have been doing this for years. And according to normal caloric calculations, I should be dead. Or at least looking anorexic. Or at least looking malnourished of some sort. And clearly I wasn't. So I thought, and that was the other model. So the constraint model, which basically states, the idea is that given a certain energetic intake, the body becomes more efficient in extracting energy out of that. So when people, you see this in athletes, you think, how some of these people, given what they eat, assuming that we actually know what they're eating. But I worked at the gym to pay for my studies in nutrition. And I was looking at diet, and especially the people that are in the elite group at the time. And now you think these people should not be alive. So they either lie to me and not write everything down that they do, because calories don't add up. And when then they go keto, it's even worse. There is an even bigger discrepancy. So I thought, what the heck is going on in here? And what we're starting, so that question from Tommy kind of prompted us to research in this metabolic efficiency. So when someone is highly metabolically efficient, is able to extract energy very, very well from specific substrate quantities, which normally, under normal caloric calculations, we wouldn't be able to explain it. And I met at a conference a professor from UCL, I believe, UCL, University College London, yes. And I proposed our research and say, look, what do you think? It's off the cuff. You can ask me to get lost and say that it's all a bunch of nonsense. And she was really taken. I said, I have never thought of thinking differently from a calorie. That calorie is what we measure. I said, well, we found that there could be some potential strong divergences between caloric calculation and true energetic requirements, because someone that has type 2 diabetes constantly require energy and they have to constantly eat. You see some people that are overweight, and they think, I'm having a low, I'm having a hypo, I need to eat right now. And you think, and you measure the glucose, and in some of them, it's actually really, really low. And you think, hang on a minute, you're 2, 3, 4 stones in weight, or I don't know, whatever, how many pounds. So you're pretty overweight. How come that your body cannot access that, and you have to constantly feed yourself in order to generate energy? And that I never really understood. It's like, as a motorbike racing engineer at the time, I thought this is like having the tank, but you need to drive around the petrol station because your engine cannot access the energy in the tank. And this is what tends to happen often in people that I tend to classify, or we tend to classify, non-metabolically efficient. Whereas healthy athletes are the ones that are very, very, very efficient in order to drive. Take the people of Tour de France, for example, or people, any high-end world GC elite athlete, cyclist, yeah? And you think, okay, I've met a few, and this is what they do. One, because the body cannot get more substrate during a performance. They can refuel afterwards, but we still need to explain the performance. But over a period of 3 weeks, yeah, they get leaner, they lose mass, but they're still alive. And if you calculate the caloric requirements, it's if they sleep for 8 hours and they cycle for between 3 and 6, there isn't actually that much more time allocated to eat. So it's quite interesting to actually see the two. Someone very poorly metabolically flexible, having to eat all the time in order to maintain that overweight, and other people being very, very lean, able to go for very strong and prolonged bout of time without having to feed. And this is where the two models come in. So the additive model and the constrained model.
Could there be a connection here between, just throwing it out in the air, insulin sensitivity, or if not insulin sensitivity, could it be something else that is creating this compensatory mechanism to increase efficiency from the nutrients?
Brilliant question, which we are wanting to publish a paper on it, and we've done some research. The answer is yes, it's heading that way, because we think that inflammation, which affects insulin sensitivity, seems to drive part of that efficiency, part of that ability to withstand substrate. Dietary proportion also seems to have an effect too. Hormonal changes, neurotransmitters, so all of these things tend to account, but mainly the two that we are looking at the most is heart rate variability and fasting glucose. And this is the reason why I put together a formula, which this is what we want to publish, hopefully in early 2019, of using heart rate variability, the time domain of the heart rate variability divided by the square of the glucose, in my case, millimolar. Otherwise, it's much easier to calculate that. So where it's a sign of metabolic flexibility. I'm saying it's a sign. It's not a diagnosis. It's not anything that you can say, right, this is this, therefore you will have that. It's a loose marker to try to understand if the body is either heavily sympathetically activated or chronically inflamed, or both. And that seems to have a very strong correlation to someone that is highly metabolically flexible. Put it this way, if someone is heavy insulin resistant, they are unlikely to be able to go for prolonged time without having to eat and feeling still okay. They're unable to exercise fasted very well. They're unable to do all the things that require the body to actually access these reservoirs that we have, and yet they're overweight. So that is how I define it. So definitely insulin is part of the problem. I'm so sorry. Insulin resistance is part of the problem. Insulin is not a problem. Just to make clear.
Got it. Awesome. Let's touch on this final topic, which is heart rate variability, and then we'll probably schedule something for a later date and deal with the rest of the questions. So you've put a lot of emphasis on this concept of heart rate variability. Why is that, and what impacts that?
So I'll answer the first question because naturally that will answer the second one through just by logical thinking. Heart rate variability can be used as a proxy of the measure of the sympathetic nervous system activation versus the parasympathetic nervous system activation. If you want to be more precise, the heart rate variability, it measures the activation, the presence of parasympathetic tone. So when the heart rate variability reduces or is reduced in an individual, normally it's because there is a sympathetic activation. Most of the times that has a reflection of an inflammatory response. At times it doesn't. So most of the times the two go hand in hand. So when somebody has a strong sympathetic activation, also is inflamed, but not always. And this is where my research went. In athletic performance, their heart rate variability is very, very high, and normally their inflammatory response seems to affect the glucose first rather than heart rate variability, meaning that their metabolic ability is affected before the nervous system activity, if that makes any sense.
Okay.
So what I'm trying to say is that heart rate variability is a way that people can have. So people can have an insight of how the body is dealing with stresses from the environment. It was originally research for myocardial infarction, so heart attacks. They noticed that people that had a heart attack and people that were about to have a heart attack have very, very reduced variability between heartbeats. So that it was very metronome-like kind of thing, which normally isn't a good sign. And you can imagine that if you have your stress hormones or stress activation controlling the heartbeat by making it faster or more pounding or whatever, then it becomes very, very regular. Whereas if you let it free, then it may not be as regular. So that's in a nutshell what it is. So I tend to use heart rate variability to identify in some people if I need to investigate further on specific aspect of their lives. Is affected by training, is affected by sleep, is one of these things that if you Google, if you search on PubMed, for example, heart rate variability, you see so many different ramifications. So you find studies on diabetics that have reduced heart rate variability. You find studies on people that are diseased with cardiovascular disease that are also affected. Sleep, depression. It's an endless amount of ramification that you can have. So basically, you can use a proxy that if you think, right, heart rate variability compared to population data and gender and etc. is not optimal, then in that case, you may want to further investigate that. So I tend to use that as a proxy to say, right, what is affecting the heart rate variability? I have a few videos on my website. They're all free. They're all there. There is nothing to buy. So people can perhaps, listen to those if they want or watch them to have a better understanding.
Awesome. Fantastic. We've blown through 1.5 hours. This was a really good podcast. And speaking of your website, let's wrap it up here and let's let people know how can they find you and reach out to you.
Sure. Is my full name, alessandroferretti.co.uk. That simple. If they go in the video section, I haven't updated it for quite a few months. So, yeah, but all the podcasts and stuff done, all my work and most of my work, some of my work is there. I don't sell anything. There is a link to an app that links with metabolic flexibility, but it's web-based and it's free. So, you know, the pro version may come on the market, but people still able to use the free. They don't even have to buy the other one. One is not out yet, so it doesn't matter. But two, they can just use that. And all my work is in there, so they can just, watch that, and it's all free.
Awesome.
Just obviously, some people ask me some really technical questions that I would only answer if they would be patients of mine. Some people send me emails and saying, okay, I've got this and I've got 4 pages. I said, dude, when I will see people from the public again, then I will answer that. But just people perhaps need to be mindful that if they ask me like a general direction, they're always welcome. But, this is my glucose level, this is my fasting of this, and this is my that, and this is this, and what do I do? Well, there is a certain element of one, professionalism, but two, also of kindness.
Got it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast show. Appreciate your knowledge, and like I said, I think we could do a lot more, and we should in the future.
Just give me buzz, and I'm sure I'll fit something in. I'll work something out.
Awesome. Well, Alessandro, thank you so much for being on the show, and thanks for everybody who have listened to the show as well. Thank you for listening to the show. You can visit us at ketogeek.com to check out our premium keto-friendly and low-carb food products, including our infamous energy pods, made from the best ingredients we could find in the entire country. We also recommend signing up for our newsletter at ketogeek.com/signup, where you get exclusive discounts, rewards, product announcements, and the latest content we are working on. You also get a 10% discount on your entire order when you sign up. Go to ketogeek.com/signup to join the low-carb playground.